In the spring of 1200 BC, a young girl named Nefertari stood in the courtyard of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, while a group of priests carefully shaved her head until every strand of hair was gone. She was only 9 years old. Her father, a low-ranking official, had brought her to the temple 3 days earlier. He owed the temple a debt that he could not repay in grain or silver, so he settled it with his own child. Nefertari didn't fully understand what was happening. Her father told her she was receiving a great honor, that she would serve the gods and should be proud and obedient. But when the cold bronze razor scraped across her scalp, removing the long black braids she once wore proudly, Nefertari began to cry. An older priestess struck her across the face. "Servants of the god do not cry," the woman said sharply. "You have no tears left, no name left. You belong to Amun now, and Amun does not tolerate weakness." That moment marked the beginning of Nefertari's new existence, a life that would last 43 years. A life built on confinement, control, and systematic exploitation, hidden behind walls painted with scenes of divine perfection. She would never leave the temple again, never marry, never own property, and never decide what happened to her body or her future. But here's what most people never realize. Nefertari wasn't alone. She was one of thousands of girls and women who lived and died inside Egypt's temples, dressed in purity, but trapped in servitude. They carried titles that sounded sacred: wives of the god, servants of the god, hands of the goddess, the pure ones. But behind those beautiful names was a system that destroyed lives. This is the truth the hieroglyphs will never tell you. And what follows is not myth. It's documented in papyri, temple archives, and ancient records. It's the story of how religious power can be twisted to control and exploit the vulnerable. If you want to uncover the darkest corners of human history, help this channel grow, hit like and subscribe, because what's coming next is far darker than you imagine. When people today hear about temple virgins or priestesses of Egypt, they imagine something graceful. Elegant women in white linen performing sacred rituals, honored and respected servants of the gods. But that image is completely false, a product of ancient propaganda. Let's break down what these women actually were. The most common Egyptian term was Hemet, meaning servant of the god or wife of the god. Other designations included Shemayat, singer or musician, and Kenret, a broader word for temple attendant. Each had specific roles, but all shared one truth. These women were bound to temple service, strictly controlled by its hierarchy and stripped of autonomy and identity. And about that word, virgin, it didn't mean sexual innocence the way we think of it now. In temple language, purity meant ritual purity, a state defined by the priests. It referred to being untouched by the profane, but this purity was imposed through control over the women's bodies, their movements, and their relationships. They were kept pure for the gods, which in real terms meant they were kept accessible to the priests who claimed to represent those gods. And here's the crucial truth. Most of these women never chose this life. Many were given to the temple as children, long before they could understand what it meant. Families would dedicate daughters as religious offerings, sometimes to gain divine favor, other times just to feed fewer mouths. What was presented as an act of piety was, in reality, a permanent surrender. The girl was given away and never came back. Others were given as payment for debt, just like Nefertari. Temples in Egypt weren't only religious centers, they were economic giants, owning vast lands, lending grain and silver, and collecting taxes. When families couldn't pay, they often paid with their daughters. It was state-sanctioned human trafficking, wrapped in religious devotion. And then there were the girls who never had families to offer them, the ones taken as tribute. Egyptian armies routinely captured people from Nubia, Libya, and the Levant. Among them were young girls and women, delivered to temples and absorbed into a system of holy servitude from which escape was impossible. The ages of these girls were horrifyingly young. Records written on papyri mention initiates entering temple service at just 8 or 9 years old, many before puberty. They were children, incapable of consent. Let me tell you about one of them, a girl named Mutemuia. She was 8 years old when Egyptian soldiers came to her Nubian village. They were collecting tribute, gold, grain, ivory, and children. Among those chosen was Mutemuia, an 8-year-old girl. She and 12 others were tied together with ropes and forced to march north, a journey stretching hundreds of kilometers that lasted for weeks. Mutemuia didn't speak Egyptian and had no idea where she was being taken. She cried without stopping until a guard struck her across the face and told her crying was forbidden. From that moment, she learned how to cry in silence. When she finally arrived in Thebes, she was assigned to the Temple of Mut, the goddess of motherhood. The cruel irony would only become clear with time. She was now serving a goddess who symbolized mothers while being denied the right to ever become one herself. The process that turned children like Nefertari and Mutemuia into possessions of the temple was intentionally designed to break them down completely, both psychologically and emotionally. Once a girl was accepted into service, she underwent a series of rituals meant to strip away her past identity and reshape her into a submissive servant of the gods. The first of these was called purification by water. The child was brought to a sacred pool, undressed, and washed repeatedly with water mixed with natron, a natural salt compound used in rituals. But what was presented as cleansing was, in reality, deeply invasive. These so-called purification baths were nothing more than ritualized examinations disguised as holy acts. The priests inspected every inch of the girl's body under the pretense of ensuring she was pure. They claimed the ritual was sacred and necessary, and that any resistance would anger the gods. When Nefertari was brought to a stone pool, 3 priests and 2 older women were waiting. She hesitated to remove her clothes, but one of the women grabbed her and tore them away. The water was freezing. One priest stepped into the pool beside her, ordering her to stand still. Then, slowly, he began to touch her in ways that made her tremble with discomfort. When she recoiled, he seized her by the arm and said coldly, "The gods are watching. They are testing your obedience." Nefertari froze in terror and endured in silence. That moment, disguised as a sacred duty, was her first violation. It set the tone for the years ahead, teaching her that her body no longer belonged to her. After the purification came the shaving ritual. Every strand of hair was removed from her head. Officially, it was said to preserve ritual purity, but in truth, it served to break the girl's sense of identity. Hair was tied to beauty, vanity, and personal pride. Removing it erased individuality. When Nefertari looked at her reflection in a bronze mirror afterward, she couldn't recognize the face staring back. That person wasn't Nefertari anymore. It was what the temple had molded her into. The next ritual was renaming. Her birth name, the one her mother gave her, was taken away forever. The priests assigned her a new identity, often something like Beloved of Ammon or Hand of the Goddess. Nefertari was renamed Nefert Nebit, meaning Beautiful is the Lady. She was ordered never to speak her true name again. The name that connected her to her family was pronounced dead. That renaming marked the symbolic death of the child's former self. She was no longer her father's daughter. She was now a creation of the temple, a living offering belonging entirely to the gods. But the process didn't stop there. After the cleansing, shaving, and renaming came the darkest ritual of all, the divine marriage ceremony. Each girl was symbolically married to the god she was destined to serve. The temple presented this as a great honor. The child was dressed in fine white linen, her bald head covered with an ornate wig and her body adorned with jewelry. She was brought before the statue of the deity, where she would swear vows of eternal service. Priests recited ritual words as if the god himself were speaking through them. They accepted the girl as the god's bride. When Mutemuia underwent this ritual, she was 10 years old. Dressed in silk white linen, her small body gleaming with golden ornaments, she was led into the inner sanctuary, a dark chamber dominated by the towering figure of the goddess Mut. The high priest began to chant in the old sacred tongue, claiming it was the voice of Mut herself. He proclaimed that Mutemuia was chosen, pure and blessed to become the goddess's bride. Then he ordered her to repeat the words, "I take the vows. I give myself to Mut." My body is her temple. My life is her property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever." She repeated each phrase without hesitation, without understanding what they truly meant. That moment bound her to the temple for the rest of her life. The priests recorded it as a holy union, but in reality, it was a legal contract of ownership. A girl who was married to a god could never marry a man. That path was permanently closed. She could never have children who were recognized as legitimate. She was bound to that institution until death. But there was something deeper about this so-called divine marriage, something in how the priests saw themselves as living representatives of the gods, and you'll understand what that meant soon enough. Life inside the temple for these servants of the divine was designed with absolute precision, structured, isolated, and controlled to eliminate any chance of rebellion or escape. Let's walk through a single day in the life of someone like Nefertari. She would wake before sunrise in a communal dormitory surrounded by dozens of other young women. The younger girls slept under the supervision of older attendants, women who had spent decades inside the system and no longer remembered freedom. Privacy didn't exist. The morning began with purification rituals. Each woman washed herself, then dressed in plain white linen robes that marked her as one of the temple's property. Afterward came the day's assigned labor. For most, that meant endless hours, weaving cloth for the temple, grinding grain, preparing offerings, or cleaning sanctuaries, monotonous work disguised as holy service. But what made it unbearable wasn't just the labor, it was the silence. The women were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Any unnecessary conversation was punished harshly. The silence severed human connection, preventing friendship or trust. They were surrounded by others, yet completely alone. Nefertari's only friend was a girl named Takayat. They worked side by side at the looms. Although they weren't allowed to talk, sometimes they whispered quietly to each other. One afternoon, the supervisor noticed. Without warning, she struck Takayat across the back of the neck with a wooden stick. Takayat was dragged outside while the overseer shouted, "This is what happens to those who break the silence." For 3 days, Takayat was gone. When she returned, she never spoke again, not even in whispers. Her eyes were lifeless. 2 months later, she vanished completely. The supervisor simply announced that Takayat had been found impure and returned to the gods. No one was told what that meant, but everyone knew. Surveillance inside the temple went far beyond that. The women were watched constantly. Their movements were restricted, contact with their families forbidden. Control over their lives extended into every aspect of their existence. They were subjected to regular inspections to ensure ritual purity. These examinations, performed by priests, were deeply invasive. Nefertari learned to disconnect her mind from her body during them, to let her thoughts drift away while the violations took place. If a woman showed unhappiness or resisted, punishment followed: extra labor, starvation, or beatings. Escape was impossible. They had been taken so young, they no longer remembered life beyond the temple walls. They had no skills, no home to return to, and no memory of freedom. They were trapped not only by stone, but by conditioning. Their education within the temple reinforced obedience. They were told they were blessed, that the priests spoke with divine authority, that their bodies were temples of the gods. It sounded spiritual, until you realized how that idea was used against them. If your body is a temple, and priests act in the name of the gods, then those same priests claim access to that temple. When Mutamuia, the Nubian girl, turned 16, she had spent 8 years in temple service, but she still carried memories of home, of her mother's songs. One night, she began to hum a familiar Nubian tune under her breath. An older woman overheard her and reported her immediately. The next morning, Mutamuia was dragged before the high priest. He struck her across the face. "You have no mother," he said coldly. "You have no other tongue but that of the gods. You have no memories except those we give you." She was locked inside a storeroom for 7 days. When she emerged, something inside her had died. She never sang again. Now listen carefully, because this is where the story becomes far darker. Among the temple women, some held a special designation, wives of the god. They participated in rituals known in inscriptions as sacred unions, ceremonies supposedly meant to reenact divine myths and ensure the fertility of Egypt. The texts describing them sound poetic, filled with metaphorical language and religious symbolism. But in reality, these ceremonies hid something horrific. High-ranking priests, especially the high priest of Amun, claimed to physically embody the god during these events. They dressed in divine garments, performed elaborate rituals, and declared that their actions represented the god working through them. The women chosen for these ceremonies were told they were about to receive the god's blessing. They were brought into the inner sanctuaries and warned that resistance would bring divine wrath, that defiance could doom all of Egypt. And then the priests, claiming divine right, enacted what they called the god's sacred marriage. Let's be clear, these were not holy unions. They were acts of coercion, encounters between powerful men and powerless women, indoctrinated from childhood to believe that their bodies belonged to the gods. When Nefertari was selected for her first sacred union ritual, she was only 14 years old. Nefertari was told that the god Amun himself would bless her. On the night of the ritual, she was led into the temple's inner sanctuary. The air hung thick with incense. The high priest, his face hidden behind an ornate mask, approached and instructed her to submit completely. Nefertari didn't understand what he meant. She froze as his hands reached to remove her garments. Then she understood and instinctively stepped back, but the other priests reassured her, whispering that this was the god's will. The high priest warned her that refusing would be blasphemy, an insult to Amun himself. What followed was recorded as a successful sacred union. But Nefertari knew the truth. It wasn't sacred, it was violation wrapped in ritual rape disguised as religion. Some women were forced to take part in these so-called unions many times. Even worse, a number of them conceived children. Those children were officially declared blessed, yet they stood as undeniable proof of what had been done to their mothers. Daughters were raised to serve the temples just as their mothers had. Sons were trained to become priests. The cycle sustained itself. At 16, Nefertari realized she was pregnant. She was moved to a separate lodging where other expectant women lived, every one of them victims of the same system. An older woman told her softly, "Don't hope too much. Once your child is weaned, it will be taken. If it's a girl, she'll serve here like us. If it's a boy, the priests will raise him. You'll still belong to the temple, just as your child will." Nefertari gave birth to a daughter. For 3 brief years, she cared for her child. Then the girl was taken away to begin her own training. Nefertari returned to her duties, seeing her daughter only from afar in the temple corridors, never allowed to speak, never allowed to acknowledge her. Watching her little girl endure the same breaking process she had once suffered was the cruelest punishment of all. Now, what happened to those who dared to resist was meant to terrify everyone else. Some women suffered what the records call dedication to the desert. They were dragged beyond the temple walls and left alone under the burning sun, without food or water, death by exposure, slow and excruciating. One such woman was Khenutma Hait. During a midday meal, she suddenly rose and shouted, "This is not holy. These men are not gods. We are prisoners." The entire hall went silent. Renutma was seized instantly and taken outside. Every woman in the temple was forced to watch as she was led into the desert and abandoned. The next morning, they were brought to see what remained of her body, already half devoured by wild animals. The high priest declared, "This is the fate of the impure." But Renutma's defiance left another kind of legacy. It taught the others that rebellion had to be silent and invisible. Resistance survived in secret meanings hidden within songs, in brief glances exchanged during prayers, or in small acts of defiance, like deliberate weaving errors that spelled faint words such as, "I resist." Most of the temple women died within those walls, spending entire lifetimes in enforced service. When they died, they were buried in unmarked mass graves, their names erased from memory. When Nefertari died at 52, her body was placed in a pit beside 3 other women, no coffin, no funeral rites. Her daughter, now grown and serving the same institution, was forbidden to mourn. The order was simple: forget she ever existed, yet some of them refused to disappear entirely. In hidden corners, on fragments of stone, they carved short messages: "I was born free. They took that from me. Remember that we were people." And there was Mutamuia, the Nubian girl. 2 days before her death, she etched her final words into the wall of a dark chamber. "I came from beyond the first waterfall. My mother's name was Manatori. I remember her voice. I never forgot who I was before they took me. This life was not my choice. If you find this, know that I lived, know that I remembered." Her message still whispers from the stone. "I existed. I mattered. Remember me." This is the truth the Egyptian temples tried to bury. Thousands of women taken as children, exploited for decades, erased in death. Today, visitors marvel at these temples' beauty, admiring their pillars and carvings, rarely realizing the suffering that unfolded within them. But now you know. When you look at those ancient walls, you'll see them differently. Behind the painted scenes of gods and kings were women like Nefertari, Mutamuia, and countless others whose names are lost. They were real people, women who endured unimaginable cruelty and still found ways to fight back, even if only through a scratch in the stone. What do you think of their story? How should history remember these monuments of oppression? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, subscribe to this channel. Here, we uncover the stories official history tried to silence. Temples still stand. The stones still remember. And now, you do too.